In 2023, a single church in Texas collected more money in 1 year than the entire GDP of some small nations. $630 million. Not from governments, not from corporations, from worshipers. The pastor drove a Lamborghini. The church owned a private jet. And when journalists started asking questions, the lawyer arrived before the pastor ever spoke. While megachurches became billion-dollar empires, over 4,500 churches across America closed their doors last year alone. Rural congregations, historic downtown sanctuaries, places where grandparents were married and children were baptized. Gone. This is the story of how the American church became American business. How tax exemptions turned into real estate portfolios. How the gospel became a product. And how faith, for millions of believers, became the most profitable industry in the nation. This is bigger than anyone realizes. Before we dive in, if you appreciate investigative journalism that challenges us to think deeper about faith, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is the kind of content that needs your support to keep going. For decades, we've watched megachurches rise. We've seen the spectacle. The light shows, the celebrity pastors, the worship experiences engineered like stadium concerts. We've heard the controversies, the scandals, the private jets, the million-dollar homes. But what we haven't fully understood is the financial machine that makes it all possible. This investigation will expose something most American Christians have never seen: the economic infrastructure behind modern ministry, the corporate boards, the licensing deals, the investment portfolios, the political lobbying, the real estate empires built on faith and funded by believers who thought their tithes were going to the poor. We're not talking about a few bad actors. We're talking about a systemic transformation of how the church operates in America. A shift so profound that the line between church and corporation has almost disappeared entirely. The crisis isn't just financial. It's theological, it's spiritual, and it's tearing apart the very foundation of what it means to be the church. Because when faith becomes profit, who pays the price? To understand how we got here, we have to go back. Not to last year. Not even to the megachurch boom of the 80s and 90s. We have to go back to 1954, the year everything changed. That year, Senator Lyndon B. Johnson introduced an amendment to the U.S. tax code. It was brief, almost forgettable. It stated that churches, like other nonprofits, could remain tax-exempt on one condition: they could not endorse political candidates. Churches accepted the deal. Tax-free status in exchange for staying out of electoral politics. For decades, this held. Churches were sacred spaces, protected by the First Amendment, funded by faithful congregations, and largely insulated from the commercial pressures of American capitalism. But then came the 1970s. The rise of the evangelical political movement. Leaders like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson saw an opportunity. Mobilize Christian voters not just spiritually, but politically. The moral majority wasn't just a voting bloc. It was a business model. Churches became organizing hubs. Pastors became power brokers. And donations, once meant for missions and mercy, began funding lobbying efforts, direct mail campaigns, and political action committees. By the 1980s, the seeds were planted. Televangelists like Jim Bakker and Jimmy Swaggart built broadcasting empires. PTL Club, the 700 Club. These weren't just ministries. They were multimillion-dollar enterprises, complete with theme parks, luxury hotels, and personal fortunes built on viewer donations. When the scandals broke in the late 80s, sexual misconduct, financial fraud, lavish lifestyles funded by widows' mites, the public was outraged. Investigations were launched. Bakker went to prison. Swaggart tearfully confessed. Reform seemed inevitable. But it never came. Instead, the model evolved. The next generation of church leaders learned the lesson. Don't be flashy. Be strategic. Don't build theme parks. Build campuses. Don't beg for money on TV. Automate giving with apps and recurring donations. Don't call it profit. Call it ministry expansion. By the early 2000s, the megachurch had arrived in full force. Willow Creek, Saddleback, Lakewood, North Point, churches with weekend attendance in the tens of thousands, budgets in the hundreds of millions, and a business infrastructure that would rival any Fortune 500 company. The language of ministry became the language of corporate America. Strategic planning, market research, branding, scalability, ROI. Pastors became CEOs. Elders became board members. Congregants became stakeholders. And the American church, once defined by sacrifice and service, became defined by success and scale. Today, the Christian church in America is a $230 billion industry. Let that sink in. $230 billion flowing through churches every single year. Some of the largest megachurches operate with budgets that exceed $100 million annually. They employ hundreds of staff. They own coffee shops, gyms, counseling centers, and media production studios. They hold investment portfolios in stocks, bonds, and commercial real estate. And because they are churches, they pay no federal income tax, no property tax, no disclosure requirements. Unlike secular nonprofits, which must file public tax returns detailing executive salaries and financial expenditures, churches operate in near total financial secrecy. There is no legal requirement for churches to publish budgets, disclose pastor salaries, or report where donations go. This lack of transparency has created a culture of unchecked financial power. Pastors earning seven-figure salaries while congregants struggle with medical debt. Church boards approving private jet purchases while cutting benevolence funds. Real estate acquisitions disguised as ministry expansion that generate rental income and property value appreciation. In 2019, one megachurch spent over $12 million on a single building renovation while simultaneously laying off staff and reducing missions giving. When members questioned the decision, they were told it was necessary for reaching the next generation. The pastor's salary that year exceeded $2 million. But the crisis goes deeper than individual excess. It's about what this system has done to the nature of the church itself. Worship has become entertainment. Sermons have become TED Talks. Membership has become consumerism. And discipleship has been replaced by engagement metrics. Churches hire branding consultants. They conduct focus groups. They A/B test sermon series titles to see which generates the most first-time visitors. They track attendance data, giving patterns, and volunteer participation the way tech companies track user engagement. The goal is no longer transformation, it's growth, because growth means more revenue, and more revenue means more influence, more real estate, more staff, more programs. The machine feeds itself. Meanwhile, smaller churches, the ones without the marketing budgets, the light shows, the celebrity pastors, are dying. Rural congregations where families have worshipped for generations are closing at a rate of nearly 15 churches per day. Not because people stopped believing, but because they can't compete. The young families want the kids' programs. The millennials want the coffee bar and the Instagram-friendly aesthetics. The donations flow toward the spectacle, toward the success, toward the brand. And the gospel of Jesus, who said, "Blessed are the poor," is now most often preached from stages that cost more than most people will earn in a lifetime. So how does the machine actually work? How do churches legally become billion-dollar empires? It starts with tax exemption. Under IRS Code Section 501(c)(3), churches are automatically classified as tax-exempt organizations. They don't have to apply. They don't have to prove their charitable purpose. They simply claim religious status, and the exemption is granted. This means no federal income tax, no state income tax, no property tax, no sales tax in many states. A megachurch with a $100 million campus pays nothing in property taxes while the public schools down the street beg for funding. But the real power comes from what churches aren't required to do: disclose. While secular nonprofits must file Form 990, detailing salaries, expenses, and program spending, churches are exempt. They operate in financial darkness. This creates enormous opportunity for abuse. Pastors can set their own salaries with little to no oversight. Board members are often friends, family, or loyalists who never question financial decisions. And because donors can't see where their money goes, accountability is almost impossible. In 2020, investigative journalists discovered that several prominent megachurch pastors owned multiple homes worth millions of dollars, luxury vehicles, and private aircraft, all funded, directly or indirectly, through church finances. One pastor owned a $13 million mansion. Another had a pastor's housing allowance of $900,000 per year, all legal, all tax-free. The mechanism is simple. Churches can pay pastors housing allowances, which are exempt from federal income tax. A pastor can receive hundreds of thousands of dollars, use it to buy a mansion, and pay zero income tax on that money. It's one of the most generous tax benefits in the entire U.S. tax code, and it's exclusively for clergy. Then there's the business empire. Many megachurches operate what are called ministry enterprises. Bookstores, conference centers, publishing houses, media production companies. Technically, these are part of the church's mission. Legally, they generate revenue. One megachurch runs a for-profit coffee roasting business, selling beans to other churches and retail customers. Another owns a graphic design firm that takes on secular clients. A third operates a leadership training institute that charges thousands of dollars per attendee, while still operating under the church's tax-exempt umbrella. The revenue flows back into the church, or more accurately, into the organization. And because there's no financial disclosure, no one knows exactly how much or where it goes. But perhaps the most disturbing mechanism is what's called related party transactions. This is when church funds are used to benefit individuals connected to church leadership. One church paid over $5 million to a construction company owned by an elder's family member. Another hired the pastor's son-in-law as a consultant, paying him $200,000 annually. A third leased office space from a building owned by the pastor's wife. All legal, all undisclosed to the congregation. And when journalists or members start asking questions, the lawyers appear. Churches invoke religious freedom. They claim financial oversight violates the separation of church and state. They argue that transparency would compromise pastoral confidentiality and ministry effectiveness. The system is designed to prevent scrutiny, and it works. In 2021, one church member tried to access financial records after noticing that the church's budget presentation didn't match the spending visible on the campus. He was told the information was confidential. When he persisted, he was removed from membership and banned from the property. His crime? Asking where the money went. Behind every financial scandal, behind every megacampus and private jet, there are real people, believers who trusted their leaders, families who gave sacrificially, pastors who tried to speak up. Meet David. He was a worship pastor at a rapidly growing church in the Midwest. For 8 years, he led music, poured into volunteers, and watched the congregation swell from 300 to over 5,000. The church built a new campus, bought new equipment, launched satellite locations. David's salary never changed, $38,000 a year. He worked a second job to support his family. When he asked about a cost of living adjustment, he was told the church was in a season of investment. Meanwhile, the senior pastor's salary had climbed past $400,000. When David finally left, burned out and financially struggling, he learned that the church had just purchased a vacation property in Colorado for pastoral retreats. The senior pastor used it 6 times that year. David was never invited. Then there's Maria, a single mother who tithed faithfully to her megachurch for over a decade, 10% of every paycheck. She believed her money was going to missions, to the poor, to kingdom work. When her hours were cut at work and she couldn't afford her rent, she reached out to the church for help. She was told to fill out an application. It took 3 weeks to process. She was approved for $200 one-time assistance. That same month, the church announced a $4 million lighting upgrade for the worship center. Maria stopped attending, not because she stopped believing in God, but because she stopped believing the church cared about people like her. And then there's Pastor Tom. He served for 15 years at a mid-sized church in Georgia. Attendance was steady. The people were faithful. The budget was modest but sustainable. Then a new elder joined the board. He'd come from a megachurch background. He talked about growth strategies and reaching our potential. Within 2 years, the church had rebranded. New logo, new website, new service times designed to maximize accessibility. They brought in consultants, started a capital campaign, built a new children's wing. Tom was told to preach shorter sermons, avoid divisive topics, and focus on practical life application. When he pushed back, citing theological concerns, he was told he wasn't a culture fit. They let him go, gave him 3 months severance, 34 years in ministry, and he was unemployed at 57 years old. The church hired a younger pastor with a better Instagram presence and a background in marketing. Tom now works part-time at a hardware store. He still loves Jesus. He's not sure he loves the church anymore. These aren't isolated stories. They're patterns. Patterns of exploitation, of misplaced priorities, of organizations that look like churches but operate like corporations. And the casualties are faithful people who believed that the church was supposed to be different. The turning point came in 2020, not with a scandal, not with a whistleblower, with a pandemic. When COVID-19 shut down in-person services, something unexpected happened. Millions of Christians realized they didn't actually need the building. Worship moved online. Small groups met in homes. Giving continued, but not at the same levels. And churches had to make a choice: cut spending or find new revenue. Some chose wisely. They reduced staff salaries across the board, including pastoral leadership. They sold unused property. They redirected missions funds to community relief efforts. Others did the opposite. They applied for Paycheck Protection Program loans. Government relief meant for struggling businesses. Dozens of megachurches received millions in federal funds while still maintaining multimillion-dollar reserves. One church with over $200 million in assets received a $4 million PPP loan. When questioned, they said it was to protect jobs. None of the senior leadership took pay cuts. But the most revealing moment came when churches reopened. Attendance didn't return to pre-pandemic levels. Giving didn't fully recover. And suddenly, the financial fragility of these massive organizations was exposed. The billion-dollar machine, it turned out, was built on constant growth. When growth stopped, the cracks appeared. Staff layoffs, budget cuts, building projects halted, and the language shifted from kingdom expansion to financial sustainability. The pandemic revealed what many had suspected but few had said out loud. The modern megachurch model is unsustainable. It requires ever-increasing revenue to maintain operations, cannot survive stagnation, and when believers stop showing up, the machine grinds to a halt. The turning point wasn't a scandal. It was exposure. The curtain pulled back, and millions of Christians saw, for the first time, what the church had become. So where do we go from here? The future of the American church sits at a crossroads. One path leads toward continued corporatization. Larger organizations, more centralized control, greater financial opacity. Churches as brands, faith as franchise. Already, multi-site models are expanding. One pastor broadcast to dozens of campuses across multiple states. Centralized budgets, unified branding. It's efficient, it's scalable, and it removes local accountability almost entirely. The other path leads toward decentralization. Smaller congregations, local leadership, transparent finances, and a return to the New Testament model of church as community rather than corporation. Ironically, this is already happening, not by design but by necessity. As megachurches struggle to retain members post-pandemic, house churches and micro-congregations are growing. People meeting in living rooms, sharing meals, studying scripture without the stage lights and smoke machines. These communities have no buildings, no budgets, no paid staff, and yet, many participants describe them as the most authentic church experience they've ever had. The question is whether institutional Christianity will reform itself or whether it will collapse under the weight of its own excess. there are signs of potential change. Some megachurches have begun voluntarily publishing detailed financial reports. A few have implemented salary caps for senior leadership. Others have restructured governance to include more congregational oversight. But these remain exceptions. The vast majority of large churches continue to operate in financial secrecy, resist accountability, and prioritize growth over discipleship. The theological implications are staggering. When the church operates like a business, it begins to think like a business. Success is measured in numbers, not transformation. Leaders are valued for their ability to attract crowds, not their spiritual maturity. And the gospel message itself gets shaped by market research. What sells? Hope, positivity, practical advice. What doesn't sell? Repentance, sacrifice, suffering, the cross. And so the message shifts, subtly at first, then dramatically, until what's being preached from the stage bears little resemblance to what Jesus preached on the Mount. The future of American Christianity may not be decided by theologians or pastors. It may be decided by ordinary believers who simply refuse to participate in the machine any longer, who choose faithfulness over success, community over celebrity, generosity over growth. The billion-dollar church machine is powerful, but it's not inevitable, and it's not eternal. There's a moment in the Gospel of Matthew that haunts me. Jesus enters the temple and sees what it's become, a marketplace, money changers, merchants, commerce masquerading as worship. And he overturns the tables. Not with a sermon, not with a committee meeting, with righteous anger and holy disruption. My house will be called a house of prayer, he says, but you are making it a den of robbers. I wonder what Jesus would say if he walked into some of our churches today. Would he recognize them? Would he overturn the coffee bars and the bookstores and the capital campaign posters? Or would he weep? Because here's the truth. The church was never supposed to be an empire. It was supposed to be a body, messy, diverse, broken, beautiful, a community of sinners saved by grace, caring for one another, serving the marginalized, proclaiming hope to the hopeless. The early church had no buildings, no budgets, no branding. They met in homes, shared their possessions, broke bread together, and the world watched in wonder because their love was so radically different. Somewhere along the way, we traded that for something bigger, louder, more impressive. We built kingdoms when we were called to serve a king. But the good news is this: the church is not a building. It's not an organization. It's not a budget line or a branding strategy. The church is people, redeemed, reconciled, and sent. And no amount of corporate corruption can destroy what Jesus is building. The billion-dollar machine will eventually crumble. Buildings will close. Budgets will fail. Brands will fade. But the bride of Christ, the true church, will endure. She always has. So maybe the question isn't what's wrong with the church? Maybe the question is, will we have the courage to be the church? To gather simply, give sacrificially, love radically, serve humbly, and trust that the gospel doesn't need our buildings to change the world. It never did.